Karen had always been the kind of person who believed rules were meant to be bent, if not broken. She had a habit of challenging authority and thought of herself as someone who stood up for her rights. So when she and her teenage son, Alex, landed in London for their long-awaited vacation, she was excited, but also unimpressed. The city was beautiful, no doubt. The grand buildings, the double-decker buses, the historic streets, everything looked like a scene from a postcard. But Karen found some things too strict, too formal. The way people followed rules without question made her shake her head. Back home, she often told Alex, "We know how to have fun. People aren't this serious." One thing that caught her attention was the royal guards, the famous soldiers who stood like statues outside Buckingham Palace, never moving, never reacting. She had seen videos online of people trying to make them laugh or flinch, and she found it amusing. "They're just regular people," she told Alex. "It's ridiculous how they act like robots." The next morning, they joined a crowd outside Buckingham Palace. Tourists gathered, snapping photos and whispering about how impressive the guards looked in their red uniforms and tall black hats. The golden gates of the palace shimmered under the sun, and the atmosphere buzzed with excitement. But Karen wasn't impressed. She smirked, watching as people respected the invisible line that separated them from the guards. "That's so silly," she muttered. "Why does everyone treat them like they're made of stone?" Alex, who was more reserved than his mother, shrugged. "It's their job, Mom. They're trained to do this." Karen scoffed. "Trained for what? Standing still. It's a joke." She decided then and there that she was going to do something different, something that would make this trip memorable. She didn't want to just take a picture. She wanted to see if she could break their famous stillness. A little harmless fun, she thought. Walking confidently toward one of the guards, she ignored the quiet warnings from other tourists. A few people noticed her and exchanged glances, sensing trouble, but Karen didn't care. She stood right in front of the guard, a young man with a strong jawline and an unshakable expression. She waved her hand in front of his face. No reaction. She chuckled, leaning closer. "Hey, soldier boy, are you even real?" she teased. The crowd grew uneasy. People took out their phones, sensing something was about to happen. Alex whispered urgently, "Mom, stop. This isn't funny." But Karen was having too much fun. She pretended to trip, barely missing the guard's foot. Still, he didn't move. Her amusement turned to frustration. She hated being ignored. "Fine," she muttered. "Let's see how much you can take." And with that, she reached into her purse, ready to do something she would regret forever. Karen's fingers wrapped around the small can of pepper spray in her purse. She had carried it everywhere back home, always saying it was for self-defense. But now, an idea sparked in her mind, one that she found amusing. If this guard was trained to stand still no matter what, would he react to a little surprise? She wasn't trying to hurt him, just to prove a point. Maybe get a reaction. Maybe even make the internet laugh. Around her, the crowd of tourists whispered, sensing that something wasn't right. Some had their phones raised, recording everything. Alex, standing a few feet away, felt his stomach drop. He knew his mom could be stubborn, but this was different. "Mom, stop," he said, his voice low but urgent. "You're gonna get in trouble." Karen barely heard him. She was focused on the guard in front of her, his expression frozen, his eyes staring straight ahead. He looked so serious, so unshakable, and for some reason, that only made her more determined. She lifted the small canister and pressed the button, releasing a short burst of mist into the air between them. Everything happened in an instant. The guard didn't flinch, didn't blink. His training was stronger than any surprise attack. But within seconds, the response Karen hadn't expected came from somewhere else. A sharp voice cut through the murmuring crowd. "Step back. Hands where we can see them." Karen felt a rush of movement behind her before she even had time to process what was happening. Armed guards, stationed nearby, sprang into action. In the blink of an eye, Two officers rushed forward, grabbing her arms and pulling her back with swift, practiced movements. The pepper spray slipped from her fingers, clattering onto the pavement. The crowd gasped. Some people backed away, while others moved in closer, their phones capturing every second. Karen's heart pounded. This wasn't funny anymore. This wasn't just a harmless prank. "What are you doing?" she shouted, struggling against their firm grip. "I didn't do anything." But the guards weren't listening. One of them spoke into a radio while the other secured her wrists. She wasn't being roughly handled, but there was no room for argument. They were treating this as a serious incident. Alex's face had gone pale. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. His mother, the woman who always talked about standing up for herself, about never letting anyone tell her what to do, was now completely powerless. "Mom," he called out, but he didn't know what else to say. Karen's confidence cracked. Her mind raced. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She had expected maybe a warning, maybe a laugh from the crowd. But now, she was standing in the middle of Buckingham Palace grounds, held by security, surrounded by people staring at her like she had done something truly terrible. And for the first time, real fear settled in. Karen's mind was spinning as she stood frozen, her arms held firmly by the guards. The weight of the situation hit her like a wave, but she still couldn't believe it. This was supposed to be a joke, a harmless way to see if the guard would react. But now she was in serious trouble, and there was no way to talk her way out of it. Around her, the crowd had fallen into a tense silence. Some people looked shocked, others whispered to each other, and a few were still recording. She could feel the weight of their stares pressing down on her, making her regret every decision that had led to this moment. "Ma'am, you are under arrest," one of the guards said in a calm but firm voice. Karen's eyes widened. "What? Arrest? For what?" The guard didn't hesitate. "For assaulting a member of the Royal Guard." "Assault?" Karen repeated in disbelief. "I didn't hurt him. It was just..." Her words were cut off as one of the officers stepped forward. "You used a prohibited substance on a royal officer. That is considered an offense under the law." Karen opened her mouth to argue, but no words came out. She wanted to say it was a joke. She wanted to explain that she hadn't meant any harm. But none of that mattered now. The rules were clear, and she had broken them. Alex stood nearby, his face pale, his hands clenched into fists. He had never seen his mother look this helpless before. She had always been so sure of herself, so certain that she could handle anything. But now she looked lost. "Please," Alex finally spoke, his voice shaking. "She didn't mean it like that. She didn't know." The officer looked at him for a moment, then back at Karen. Ignorance of the law does not change the consequences. Karen's heart pounded. "But..." "Ma'am," the guard interrupted, his voice still calm but leaving no room for argument. "You need to come with us." Karen felt a lump rise in her throat. This was real. This was actually happening. She wasn't just getting a warning. She wasn't being scolded like a misbehaving tourist. She was being arrested. The guards guided her away from the palace grounds, and she felt every pair of eyes on her. Her legs felt heavy as she walked, her mind racing with fear and regret. As she was led toward a police vehicle waiting nearby, she glanced back at Alex. His face was filled with worry, but also something else: disappointment. She had always thought she was the one teaching him how the world worked. But in this moment, she realized he was the one who had understood all along. And now, she was the one who had to face the consequences. Karen sat in the back of the police vehicle, her hands still trembling. The seriousness of the situation was sinking in, and for the first time in her life, she had no idea what to do. She had always been able to talk her way out of trouble, to argue until she got her way. But this time, no one was listening. No one cared about her excuses. The streets of London passed by outside the window as the vehicle moved, but Karen wasn't paying attention. Her thoughts raced. How had things gone so wrong? She had only wanted to prove a point, to have a little fun. But now she was being taken away like a criminal. Alex wasn't with her. He had been left behind with one of the officers, who had assured him that someone would contact him soon. The look on his face when she was taken away haunted her. He had been scared, embarrassed, and disappointed all at once. That hurt more than anything else. When the vehicle stopped, Karen was led into a police station. The bright lights, the serious expressions of the officers. Everything felt unreal. She had never imagined she would end up in a place like this, especially not in another country. An officer guided her to a small room and gestured for her to sit down. "We'll be asking you some questions shortly," he said before stepping out. The door clicked shut behind him. Karen sat there, her heart pounding. She had never felt so alone. She had always been in control of her life, always confident in her choices. But now she wasn't in charge. Someone else was making the decisions, and she couldn't do anything about it. Minutes felt like hours before another officer walked in, carrying a file. He sat across from her and opened it, flipping through some papers before looking up. "Do you understand why you are here?" he asked calmly. Karen swallowed hard. I didn't mean any harm," she said, her voice quieter than usual. "I was just trying to see if the guard would react." The officer didn't react to her words. He simply nodded and glanced at the papers in front of him. "You used a prohibited substance against a member of the Royal Guard. That is a serious offense." Karen's stomach tightened, but he wasn't even hurt. He didn't react at all. The officer met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "That does not change the fact that what you did was against the law." Karen looked down at her hands. She felt small, powerless. She had never thought about the consequences when she acted. She had assumed that, like always, she would get away with it. But now she was facing the reality of her actions. As the officer continued speaking, explaining the legal process and what could happen next, Karen barely heard him. The only thought running through her mind was simple but terrifying. She had made a mistake, a terrible mistake, and there was no way to undo it. Karen sat in the small, cold room, her mind racing. The reality of her situation was hitting her harder with each passing second. She had always been the one in control, always the one who talked her way out of trouble. But here, in this police station, her words had no power. The officer in front of her continued speaking, his voice calm but firm. "You are being charged with assaulting a member of the Royal Guard," he said, flipping through the papers in the file. "This is considered a serious offense." Karen took a shaky breath. "But I didn't mean to hurt him," she insisted. "I just thought." The officer held up a hand, stopping her. "Intent does not change the action," he said. "The law is clear. The Royal Guard is a protected unit, and any form of attack, whether physical or with a substance, is treated with full seriousness." Karen wanted to argue. She wanted to tell him it wasn't fair, that she wasn't a criminal. But deep down, she knew it wouldn't matter. She had crossed a line, and now she had to face the consequences. She glanced at the table, her fingers gripping the edge. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice quieter than before. The officer leaned back slightly. "You will be processed and possibly fined," he explained. "There is also the matter of whether further legal action will be taken. In some cases, this could result in a ban from the country." Karen's heart sank. A ban. She had heard of people being banned from entering certain countries for breaking laws, but she never thought she would be one of them. This wasn't how her trip was supposed to go. Just then, the door opened and another officer stepped in. He handed a paper to the officer questioning Karen, then turned to her. "Your son has been contacted," he said. "He is safe and waiting with one of our officers." Karen felt a wave of relief. At least Alex was okay. But that relief was short-lived as she imagined how he must be feeling right now, alone, confused, maybe even angry at her. She looked up at the officer. "Can I see him?" The officer exchanged a glance with his colleague before nodding. "We will allow it, but only briefly." A few minutes later, the door opened again, and Alex stepped inside. He looked nervous, his hands stuffed into his pockets. His usual confidence was gone. Karen forced a small smile. "Hey, sweetheart." Alex didn't smile back. "Mom," he said, his voice tight. "Why did you do that?" Karen's heart ached at the disappointment in his voice. She opened her mouth, searching for the right words, but for the first time, she had none. She had always believed she was teaching Alex about the world. But now she realized he was the one teaching her, a lesson she had learned too late. Karen looked at Alex, her throat tight with guilt. His eyes, usually full of admiration for her, now held something else. Disappointment. It hurt more than anything the officers had said. I didn't think," she finally whispered. "I thought it was just a joke." Alex sighed and shook his head. "Mom, this isn't a joke. You sprayed a guard. What did you think was going to happen?" Karen wished she had an answer, but she didn't. When she had done it, she hadn't thought past the moment. She had wanted attention, had wanted to prove a point. But now, sitting in a police station with her son looking at her like she had let him down, she realized just how foolish she had been. The officer standing by the door cleared his throat. "Your mother is being processed for this offense," he told Alex. "She may face a fine and a ban from the country." Alex's eyes widened. "A ban? So, we can never come back?" The officer nodded. "It's possible." Karen swallowed hard. This was supposed to be a fun trip. They had planned to see so many things. The Tower of London, the British Museum, a boat ride on the Thames. But instead, she had turned it into a disaster. She had ruined everything. Alex exhaled and ran a hand through his hair. "I don't understand, Mom. Why do you always have to push things too far?" Karen flinched. She had never seen him this upset before. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she said. "I thought I was just having fun." Alex gave her a long look. "But it wasn't fun. It was embarrassing. You always say people should respect you. But you didn't respect that guard. He was just doing his job." His words hit her harder than she expected. She had spent years teaching Alex to stand up for himself, to be confident, to never let anyone walk over him. But now she was the one in the wrong. She had disrespected someone else just because she thought she could. The officer spoke again. "Your son can leave with our team. He will be taken back to the hotel. You, however, will remain here for further processing." Karen looked at Alex with panic. "You're going alone?" Alex nodded. "Yeah, Mom. I'll be fine." Karen felt helpless. She wanted to hug him, to promise she would fix this, but she knew she couldn't. Not this time. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Alex didn't say anything for a moment. Then, finally, he nodded. "I know." As he was led out of the room, Karen sat back in her chair, feeling the full weight of her actions. For the first time in a long time, she realized she had no control over what happened next, and that scared her more than anything else. Karen sat alone in the small room, her hands resting on her lap. The silence around her felt heavier than ever. She had spent her whole life believing she was always right, that rules were just obstacles meant to be challenged. But now she wasn't so sure. Minutes passed, then an hour. The officers had left her alone for a while, probably to let her think about what she had done. And it worked. She was thinking about everything. How she had embarrassed Alex, how she had ruined their trip, how she had turned a moment of fun into something serious. Eventually, the door opened, and the officer from earlier walked in. He held a few papers in his hand and sat across from her. "We have spoken with the authorities and reviewed the situation," he said in a calm voice. Karen's heart pounded, and he glanced at the papers. "You will not be facing jail time, but you will be fined for your actions." Karen let out a shaky breath. At least she wasn't going to prison. But then the officer continued. "Additionally, you will be banned from entering the United Kingdom for the next 5 years." Her relief faded. 5 years, she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. The officer nodded. That is the decision. You will need to leave the country as soon as the fine is paid. Karen felt her stomach twist. She had seen people get banned from places on the news, but she had never imagined it would happen to her. This was supposed to be a vacation. Now it was a punishment she could never escape. Can I at least see my son before I go? She asked, her voice quieter than before. The officer's face softened slightly. Yes, he will be waiting for you when you are released. A few hours later, after paying the fine and signing the necessary paperwork, Karen stepped out of the police station. The cool London air hit her face, and for the first time in her life, she didn't feel like she belonged. Alex stood near a car, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Karen walked up to him slowly. Alex. He cut her off. Let's just go, Mom. His words stung, but she didn't argue. She climbed into the car, and they drove in silence. The ride back to the hotel felt longer than before. Every time she glanced at Alex, he was staring out the window, lost in thought. When they reached their hotel room, Karen sat on the edge of the bed and sighed. I really am sorry, she said softly. Alex finally turned to her, his face less angry now, but still disappointed. I know, Mom, but sorry doesn't change what happened. Karen looked down, knowing he was right. She had made a mistake, one that wouldn't be easy to fix. And now, she had to live with it. The next morning, Karen woke up feeling exhausted. She had barely slept, her mind replaying everything that had happened. The police station, the fine, the 5-year ban. It all felt like a bad dream. But it wasn't. It was real, and there was nothing she could do to change it. She turned to look at Alex, who was already awake, scrolling through his phone. He hadn't spoken much since they got back to the hotel. She wanted to say something, anything, to make things better. But what could she say? Instead, she sighed and sat up. We should get ready. Our flight is in a few hours. Alex didn't look up. Yeah. His short response made Karen's heart sink. He had always been close to her, always looked up to her, but now something was different, and she knew she was the reason why. As they packed their bags, Karen hesitated. Alex, she said slowly, I know I messed up, and I know saying sorry isn't enough, but I really do regret what I did. Alex finally looked at her. I just don't get it, Mom. You always tell me to be respectful, to think before I act, but you didn't do that. Karen swallowed hard. I know, and you're right. I didn't think. I was too focused on proving a point, on getting attention, and it was wrong. For the first time, Alex's expression softened. I just don't want you to always push things too far, he said. Sometimes it's okay to just follow the rules. Karen nodded. I get that now. They finished packing in silence, then checked out of the hotel. As they drove to the airport, Karen glanced out at the city, knowing it would be a long time before she could return. She had ruined this trip, not just for herself, but for Alex too. At the airport, as they waited for their flight, Alex finally spoke again. You know, I still had fun before all this happened, he said. London was cool. Karen gave a small smile. Yeah, it is. He looked at her. Maybe next time, we can just enjoy a trip without trying to prove something. Karen nodded. Next time, I'll do better. As they boarded the plane, she knew she couldn't erase what had happened, but she could learn from it. And maybe, just maybe, she could prove to Alex and to herself that she could change.